Okay, good afternoon. My name is Rudolph Nsang. I am a language and literature teacher in Cameroon. Good to be with you. Today we are going to look at the poem by Robert Frost titled Out Out, a very beautiful work of art that tells us not only of beauty, but of universal truth. It tells us of fate, the fate of every human being. We, like grass or like flower, we are born to live very briefly and then we die, sometimes even in very unexpected ways. So this poem is set in Vermont, in terms of space and in terms of times, 1916. If you're conversant with the time 1916, you know the poem was written in between the start and the end of the First World War. And Vermont is a place, a state today in a way, in New England, in somewhere in the United States of America, a place that sent out a lot of soldiers to fight during the First World War. And of course, like in every conflict situation, um, you understand people get to die, so there's loss of life, there's loss of property, but also, in most cases, there's a loss of mental well being. Okay, so this poem is set within that kind of atmosphere, and we can already begin to imagine what would happen to young boys, to young girls, to men and women who perhaps didn't go to war or who had come back from war. What could be like their daily routine in their daily lives. So, literally, this poem out talks about a young man who's working with a boost machine or a boost saw, and he's sawing perhaps a log of wood into little pieces he could use for the stove, and suddenly the saw, backfire or gets out of the wood and injures him on the hand. And though he hopes that this hand, gets well or is not being amputated by the doctor, um, the hand is later amputated, but it doesn't just end there. After the amputation, he loses so much blood and then he dies. But the reaction of the people around him after he dies is also, one to take note of. They just don't care. Okay, after the short time they are with him, and when he dies, they go back to their work because they are not the ones that were being hurt. And then, this could also reflect that kind of a situation where people have died so much and or so many that people others don't get to care much about what happens when some other person dies. So it's like a normal. Death became a normal in that particular setting, and in that um, time, people would prefer to care more about themselves and go about their businesses, even if blood is being spilled. So that's like a literal description of that poem. We are going to go in a bit more into the structure. Um, but before that, I also want to indicate that the title, Out Out, is said to be inspired by a line in the book Macbeth by William Shakespeare. And this line, I'd like to read it to you. It goes out, out, brief candle. So literally, life is short and fragile. So there is this direct comparison between a candle and life. And if you've used a candle before, or you've seen maybe where a candle is being used, then you understand that once you lit a candle, it doesn't take so long for it to to die down, and then the light dies out. Okay, so just like human beings, you know, we are very okay, live and alive, good and booming and so on. And suddenly, we are off and we are out of the world. So that's where the title of the poem comes from. So I've given a literal description of the poem because, of course, it's a narrative. The poem is a narrative written in iambic pentameter with no regular rhythm. And the fact that it doesn't have, a rhyme scheme or so could be indicative of maybe the mindset of the writer at the moment when this particular situation happens, when he witnessed what actually happened. He couldn't put himself together and, just had to write something and then it came out the way it came out. So you must take note of that. Um, I decided to break the poem into different parts. Take note, this is a one stanza poem, so it doesn't have many stanzas, just one stanza. of 35 lines. Okay, so I decided to break the lines, and I'm going to tell you what each segment, talks about. So you have the poem. You could take some time to go through, because we don't have that luxury of time here. So from line 1 to line 14, okay, you're going to get about the setting of the poem, but also of what the boy is doing, the kind of work the boy is doing. From line 15 to 19, you're going to get of the accident, what happens to the boy. From line 20 to 28, you're going to get a bit, or you're going to get, but not just a bit, you're going to like to get the boy's full reaction, how he reacts to the accident. And this particular portion is very important and key to this lesson of today, because it also ties to your examination, the question that you're going to be answering in the examination. And the line 29 to line 35, you're going to see how the boy gets to die, and the last two lines, line 34 to 35, sorry, line how the boy gets to die, line 29 to 33, and the last two lines, 34 to 35, is the aftermath, how other people get to react to what happens to the boy. So before we continue, I would like to read um, the question, but also you must take note that at the end of this particular lesson, you must be able to analyze how the writer uses language and structure. Okay, I've talked a bit about the structure, so how the writer uses language and structure to influence the reader's response. The question here is, how does the writer create sympathy for the boy? And in your answer, you need to include how the accident is described. You need to talk briefly about how the boy reacts to the accident. You need to talk as well how other people get to react to the accident, and you also have to talk on the use of language. Okay, and of course you can use some portions. You can use some quotations from the poem to justify whatever ideas you get to bring up. So let's go into the poem a little bit more before we get to how the boy gets to react. So at the beginning of the poem, it says the bull saw gnawed and rattled in the yard. Okay, it gnawed and rattled in the yard. There's this personification at the very beginning. Okay, of the bull saw. It's kind of a thing will not rattle. Maybe rattling could be, or gnawing and rattling could be, say, attached to things. Let's say like rattling like a snake. Okay, so the bull saw rattles or rattling in the yard, and of course it cuts through the log of wood, and there is dust, so and made dust and drop stove length sticks of wood. Well, this is just kind of opening of the poem, but I would like you to take note of how the poet lures us, lures the reader into thinking or believing at the beginning of the poem that everything is fine. You know, brings in a lot of beautiful imagery and brings in, So line 3 begins with, it starts this. It says, sweet scented stuff when the breeze drew across it. So that's that dust and the smell of the curtain and so on. So sweet, sweet scented, so nice, especially when the breeze blew. And from there, those that lifted their eyes could count 5 mountain range one behind the other. Okay, it talks about the beautiful how Vermont is, under the sunset into far into Vermont. You look ahead, you can see, the mountains and so on. You can just picture this beautiful scenery of mountains, succeeding each other in twilight. So beautiful. Uh, and the sun gnawed and rattled it as it ran light or hard to bear a load, and nothing happened. Of course, people kept walking, and the saw gnawed and rattled, and people kept walking, and at some point the saw is light, it makes some more noise, and when it goes to the wood, it becomes like heavy, and out and into the wood, out and into the wood, and that happened. Perhaps they had been walking from morning on to say evening, and now the sun was about to set, okay? And with all this beauty of nature and so on, and nothing had happened. Now we are going to get a transition, okay? Because the point says nothing had happened, and the day was all but dawn. So everything had happened, but something had not yet happened. In other words, many things had happened, but the day wasn't yet over. And until something is over, you can't say it's over. Something new can still happen, okay? So there's this okayness, in quotes, okayness in the poem from line 1 up to line 9. And then from line 10, we get a change of things. It says, call it a day, I wish they might have said to please the boy, but giving him the half hour that a boy counts so much when saved from work. You see, things begin to change. Certainly, this boy had worked and was tired, and he would have been happy if perhaps his supervisor or the people around had said, all right, today we are okay. We stop for today. It was a day. But that never happened. So certainly this boy had been tired because the point makes us to understand that the boy is generally very happy whenever he has like a break or something. So but a break wasn't given to him until his sister has to bring supper to him while he's working. So, like 13 says, his sister stood beside him in her apron to tell them supper. So perhaps she came straight from the kitchen, still with the apron on, and told them supper. Them who? Perhaps the boy and he saw. In line 15, it says, at the word, the saw. So at the word supper, the saw, as if to prove Saul's knew what supper meant, leaped out of the boy's hand. So perhaps the Saul heard, okay, there's also this specification. The Saul should have heard that there's supper. And like a human being would do, it jumped up, the same like the boy could, out of excitement, be so happy, to just leave work and jump straight into the kitchen or straight into the house to eat. The same thing that the Saul got to do. And but something happened. In the leaping out for the Saul or of the Saul, leaped out of the boy's hand or seemed to leap, he must have given the hand. However, it was neither refused the meeting, but the hand. So this Saul neither refused the meeting. So the Saul also wanted to go for supper, but also the Saul got the young man's hand. It's kind of like the Saul ate the young man's hand because we know normally the Saul should eat, if at all the Saul was a human being, he should eat supper. But it says it neither refused the Saul and or the boy's hand, as if it had been invited to also eat the boy's hand. The poet is just telling us that when the Saul leaped out of the wood, it backfired. It actually injured the boy's hand. That's where things really turned so bad. And then we now get the boy's reaction from line 20. It said, the boy's first outcry was a ruly laugh as he swung towards them holding up the hand, half in appeal, but half as if to keep. The boy is so much in a shock, so much that he starts by laughing. When he realizes that the saw had cut his arm, he starts by laughing. And while he laughs, he carries the arm, perhaps to the elderly ones who were around. And this arm is cut. He doesn't believe. Like in every situation where people get to face, um, say an injury or some dangerous situation, people always start by laughing, because they don't believe. So there's the whole issue of disbelief. There's a whole issue of denial. Okay, and that's his reaction. He doesn't believe that that could have happened to him, especially in that sudden way. And then um, we move on. uh, the life from spilling. No, have in appeal, that's line 22, have in appeal, but have as if to keep the life from spilling. He held his hand as though he could stop the blood. Okay, there is a direct comparison between life and blood. Of course, life is blood is life, you know, as if he could hold this blood from spilling, but the blood kept spilling. Then the boy saw all. Since he was old enough to know, um, big boy doing a man's work, though a child at heart, he saw all he saw all spoiled. In other words, the hand was gone. Okay, and normally the poet tells us normally the boy should have understood that well he lost his hand, but out of disbelief, okay, you know, he would still carry the hand and like okay maybe someone could like mend the hand together, but that was all about it. The hand had gone, and though he was a child, he was old enough to understand this kind of things. Okay, um, and then this young man, for the first time in the poem, spoke, and he says, "Don't let him cut my hand, or cut my hand off. The doctor, when he comes, don't let him, sister." So he speaks to his sister, pleading and crying that the doctor should not cut his hand, even though he knows his hand has been cut already by by the saw. And then what happens? But the hand was gone already. The doctor put him in the dark of ether. He lay and puffed his lips out with his breath, and then the watcher at his pulse took fright. Little less nothing. That's line 33. Little less nothing, and that ended it. The doctor came, of course, and nothing happened. Okay, so we can get this image of the boy breathing out his last breath, like oh, okay, which also symbolizes, him giving away or giving out life altogether, and that caused or that led to the final word, which says in lines 33, little less nothing. The poet takes his time to write this one, little less nothing, and that ended it all. And this boy was gone. The last lines, no more to build on there, and they who, the people who were walking around with him, and they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs. Of course, they went back to their normal lives, and the boy was gone. So, talking about the boy's reaction, we can get, this aspect of disbelief, this aspect of denial, which is common, when people are in trauma, and then when the boy actually, comes back to his senses, he knows that blood is oozing out, and certainly he is going to die. And then he pleads that his hand should not be cut off, even though the hand had already been cut off. Talking very briefly about the issue of language, we know that this poem is written, I think, like I earlier explained, out of rhythm. And the language is not prosaic, but it's a story, so it narrates a story, um, but not prosaic actually. Uh, but you see, we can actually get the author um, or the poet taking us through words that appeal uh, to kind of our empathy, appeals to our empathy, telling us of the story of a young boy who was all lively, all good, all nice, and then suddenly this boy is in a desperate situation and cannot actually make it. I think I'm going to stop it there. If there are any questions, because I'm already out of time, if there are any questions, then maybe I could answer that. Or if there's need for further explanation, I think I could do that um, uh, as soon as the request comes in. Thank you so much.